This was obviously a shock to the doctor because last time he had spoke to someone, George Washington was alive. He wanted to try to bring George Washington back from the fucking dead. Zombie George. If my friends don't do this for me after I'm dead, then I don't want them as friends, okay? Hi friends, welcome back to the channel. My name is Sydney, and if you are new here, this is just a place where we can talk about true crime, spooky scary stories, dark history, or anything else I got going on in my brain. So today's gonna be a quick fire little video. I don't even really know how, but I went down the rabbit hole of American history, and not like all of American history, right? Just the parts that I found interesting. And of course, you know, if it's anything to do with weird history or death, I gotta just talk about it. So we're here today. This is just gonna be a short little video, and we're gonna be talking about George Washington's death, but really the more interesting part to me anyways, is what happened after his death and the plan that this one singular man had for George Washington. So we're going to talk about it, okay? Let's get into it. So just a little disclaimer, when we're talking about events that happened, 200 plus years ago, I tried my best to find the most accurate information, but of course, there are lots of differing reports about little details, so I did the best I could to kind of make a mishmash of them all to get the most clear and concise story. But if there's anything I got wrong, as always, please inform me in the comments. I love when you guys interact and tell me what you think about the story, but also, hold me accountable if there's anything that I got wrong. If you know or have studied American history, then you probably know at least a little bit about America's first president, George Washington. He was a key player in the Revolutionary War, and then he was the president of the Constitutional Convention. I cannot say that very well, but the Constitutional Convention. And he, along with some other players, kind of helped shape and form our government. George Washington had a busy-ass life, and so I think he just kind of wanted a peaceful little place to go, a little retreat. He was also just kind of getting fed up with the divide that was happening in our country. So he and his wife, Martha, went to Mount Vernon, Vermont, where they had a plantation, and he actually ran a pretty successful distillery business as well. I don't know why, but I like to imagine George Washington at Mount Vernon, just like chilling in a Hawaiian shirt with some sunglasses, drinking a little whiskey or whatever. That's like how I want to imagine George Washington. So that kind of brings us to the start of our story, right? It's 1799, it's December, it's cold and dreary, and George Washington is spending the day riding around on horseback, kind of looking at all of his farmland. And this happened right before dinner. So George Washington was known to be pretty punctual. So as soon as he got home from riding his horse, he went straight to dinner with his guests without changing out of his wet clothes. And I guess George Washington was kind of stubborn because his wife was like, "Why don't you change out of your wet clothes?" And he was like, "No, I want to be on time to meet my guests for dinner." So I don't know. I just imagine George Washington being this sassy little retired guy. I don't know why, but anyway. So since it was December, George Washington woke up the next morning being like, oh, it snowed 3 inches. But this didn't stop him. He was just really a go-getter kind of person. So he actually went out and he went around his plantation and picked out trees on his land that had to be cut down. And reports say that progressively throughout the day, he kind of started to sound hoarse. He had a sore throat, and it just seemed to get more intense throughout the day. And then that night he woke up with a really bad cold, and Martha also woke up and she was like, "Hey babe, do you want me to call a doctor because you sound sick as hell?" And he was like, "No, it's fine. I just have a cold." Martha had just gotten over a cold, so they probably were like, "You probably just got the little bug, so we'll just wait till the morning." But when they awoke the next morning, George Washington's condition had actually worsened. In addition to kind of feeling like crap, he also had a fever, a even worse sore throat, a tight chest, and shortness of breath. So immediately Martha was like, "We are calling the doctor." And 3 doctors throughout the day actually came to George Washington's house. After examining George Washington and assessing his symptoms, the doctors decided that he probably had croup, which is a disease that causes inflammation of the airways. And the doctors, being pretty skilled and advanced in their medical technology, decided that they would use bloodletting as a way to maybe remedy the situation. At this point in history, it was believed that the body was made up of 4 humors: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. And so usually when somebody was sick, if they had an infection or a disease, The doctors thought that one of these four humors were out of balance. And so one way that doctors would kind of try to fix the disease or the infection is by bloodletting. And I don't really know if this is common knowledge, so I am going to talk about it a little bit. But bloodletting is basically the process of getting rid of some of the blood in the body. And this was thought to kind of, again, balance out those humors and drain out any toxins that might be causing disease. This is kind of funny because over time it developed and became more advanced. So there are different tools for bloodletting around this time and things like that. And people would either cut into veins or arteries. And this kind of developed into our idea of phlebotomy today, which is crazy cool, I think. And as a little side note, we actually use some very advanced bloodletting today for certain diseases. Sometimes it's necessary to get rid of some of the blood in your body. So I'm a lab nerd. I work in a lab, so all of this stuff is very interesting to me. But anyway, back to our story. So the doctors decided that bloodletting would be the best option to try to fix George Washington's illness. They performed this bloodletting procedure 4 to 5 times, and actually it was later found out that they drained about 40% of George Washington's blood. That's not great. You kind of need your blood, at least some of it. But so they tried that, and when that didn't work, they had him gargle a mixture of vinegar, butter, and molasses. And they also had him breathe in steam made from hot water and vinegar. And going along with this 4 humors theory, they also tried to induce vomiting, but again, that didn't work. George Washington's condition was just getting worse and worse as time passed. And the more different remedies they tried, the worse off George Washington was. And when none of these options were working, they decided to coat his throat in something called Spanish fly. And I have no idea how common this is, but it's like basically a mixture of ground up dried beetles. And these kind of beetles actually cause major blistering. So this would have been extremely painful on George Washington's throat. But they were just slapping that shit on, like, I don't know, maybe this will help, try this. Like, they were just kind of grasping at straws. During this time, Martha and George drafted up his will, and he told both Martha and his secretary his final requests and wishes, because at this point, it was looking a little bleak for our former president. The doctors were working hard, but it was no use, and unfortunately, George Washington passed away sometime between 10 and 11 p.m. on December 14th of 1799. I spent some time reading the accounts from George Washington's assistant, and from what I could tell, it seemed like George Washington really died with confidence. He was confident that his loved ones were around him. He was kind and courteous to his doctors, and his final words were actually "'tis well." Like, he just wanted everyone to be okay that he was dying, which is interesting. I think that it just kind of shows the person that George Washington was, very like strong-headed and confident. I don't know. It was widely speculated in the medical community what actually killed George Washington. There were theories from diphtheria to strep throat to something called quinsy, which is inflamed tonsils. But all of this wouldn't really explain the steep decline in George Washington's health. I mean, from like the 12th to the 14th. 12th, he was just fine. 14th, he's dead. Like, huh? The most widely accepted idea of how George Washington died was from something called acute epiglottis, and that kind of lines up with all of his symptoms. People that have this disease usually have a fever, a sore throat, a tight chest, and also shortness of breath. So it all just kind of lines up. After George Washington passed away, his wishes and requests were followed, and he was placed in a mahogany coffin at Mount Vernon, and he stayed there for 3 days until December 18th. This may seem kind of weird, but George Washington actually had a very valid fear of being buried alive. This was at the point when people got buried alive all the time. Like, they would just take a really long nap and they'd be like, oh, they're dead, put them in the ground. Or like they'd go into a coma for a few days and then they'd wake up and be like, I'm actually in a coffin right now. And you hear a lot of those stories of like a string being attached to the deceased finger with a bell on top, and then, you know, they'd wake up in their grave and ring the little bell and people would come and try to dig them up as fast as they could. Like, that was a real fear to have in the 1700s. So George Washington wanted to stay above ground for at least 3 days so that everybody could make sure that he was actually dead. George Washington was a smart cookie, I'm telling you. I am telling you. So anyway, it was during this time when George Washington was dead but still above ground that the strangest thing happened. And I don't know if it's just because I'm a nerd, but this is so strange to me. So George Washington had a friend, and his name was Dr. William Thornton. He was actually a pretty well-known doctor that studied at some of the best schools in Europe, and then he came back to America, and he was actually a very key player in constructing some of the most famous buildings in America, like the first U.S. Capitol, things like that. So during the time that George Washington's condition was worsening, one of his family members actually called Dr. Thornton and was like, hey, can you come to Mount Vernon because I don't think he has much time and maybe you can help. So Dr. William Thornton, being a really good friend, he went as fast as he could to Mount Vernon because he wanted to try and save his friend in any way that he could. But unfortunately, by the time he had made it, George Washington was deceased. This was obviously a shock to the doctor because last time he had spoke to someone, George Washington was alive and now suddenly he was dead. And Thornton had a game plan in his head of all the remedies he wanted to try to help George Washington, and now all of that was out the window. But just because George Washington was dead didn't mean that Dr. William Thornton was not going to try his hardest to save his bestest friend. Okay? If my friends don't do this for me after I'm dead, then I don't want them as friends. Okay? I'm just putting that out into the universe. So anyway, Dr. William Thornton, he kind of proposed this plan to Martha and everybody else around Washington's bedside. He wanted to try to bring George Washington back from the fucking dead. Zombie George. As you remember, it was December, so George Washington's dead body was quite literally frozen. And this part kind of reminds me of like what you would do with a piece of chicken that you take out for dinner and it's frozen and you got to defrost it. That's what Thornton wanted to do. He wanted to take George Washington's body and submerge it in cold water and kind of like thaw it out. And then he wanted to warm his body up as best as he could. And then he wanted to bring George Washington back from the dead. After thawing out his best friend, he wanted to perform a tracheotomy. Tracheotomy. Why do I want to say it's like geometry? It's not like geometry. Once his best friend was defrosted, he wanted to perform a tracheotomy. And this is basically opening up the airways through the throat. And you see that sometimes in movies. They're like, oh, the Heimlich maneuver's not working. We got to perform a tracheotomy. And you see somebody like stick a straw in their throat. Yeah, he wanted to do that to his friend. And on top of that, he also wanted to transfuse George Washington with lamb's blood, just to like get more blood into his body, because Thornton believed that George Washington died from A, not being able to get enough air, and B, losing all that blood from the bloodletting. So in theory, he was just going to restore the body back to its natural state. He was going to give it more blood, he was going to give it some air. And honestly, like, if George Washington wasn't like frozen solid, completely dead, this might have worked. I mean, that's kind of what you do today. Like, if somebody's having trouble breathing, you give them a way to breathe through like supplemental oxygen and you give them a blood transfusion. It's not lamb's blood, but I mean, it's very similar. He was definitely on the right track. But I'm sure when he presented this to Martha Washington and all of George's family, they probably looked at him like he was fucking nuts. I kind of imagine like a record scratch moment where everybody was listening to William Thornton, this very renowned doctor, and they were all kind of like, Is this man for real right now? Like, no, we're not doing that. They obviously said no, and this was kind of in line with what George Washington wanted. His final wishes, he was like, please don't fuss over my body. Like, once I'm dead, just put me in the ground after 3 days. Just wait 3 days. That's all I ask. And I guess after everybody said no, William Thornton was like kind of offended. He was like, what? And it appeared to be a sore subject even like 20 years later. When asked about it, he was kind of like, yeah, I had this really great idea, but they didn't want it. Which is just like funny. Like, sir, You are literally suggesting the crazy. He just seemed extremely confident that this plan would have worked, even though George Washington was literally frozen like a tomorrow night's chicken dinner. That is all I have for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed this fun little short video. I hope that you are all doing well. I appreciate each and every one of you that stayed to watch this long. I appreciate you all. I'm trying my best to get out content weekly, but it has been a little bit of a struggle lately. The mental health has not been the greatest. But yeah, we're trucking along. I hope that you guys are doing well. It can be hard sometimes just to like wake up and do the things you have to do. You just have to like make it through. Sometimes you're just gonna wake up, and as long as you are eating enough food, drinking enough water, getting some sunshine, you're basically a plant. We are all basically plants, okay? So if you're getting food, if you're getting water, and if you're getting sun, and that's all you do, that is beautiful. That is chef's kisses, okay? I care about each and every one of you. I don't know why, I just felt like I needed to go on that tangent, but I did. So I did it. I've yacked on for long enough. I hope that you guys have a good day. Thank you for watching, and keep being the bad bitches that you are. Goodbye, guys.